Live stream coming any second. Setting up our meeting. Spinning wheel. Okay. Hey there, everyone. Welcome. Welcome. It is July already. Oh my goodness. So we are back for another month to take a look at some of the astrology highlights of July and take a few questions. So if you are joining us, welcome. And of course, I have the lovely Britt here joining us. So great to see you, Britt.
Great to see you, Kelly.
How have you been? Did you enjoy June with that sweet Venus in Taurus that we talked about?
It was really nice, though I have to say it took me a while to recover from Jupiter and Gemini, that I'm only just starting to kind of ease into the Jupiter and Cancer vibes. It's
That's
summer
fair.
now.
That's fair. I mean, Jupiter and Cancer, that was such a beautiful change that we had in June, wasn't it?
hmm It really
Yeah.
was.
Yeah. And I know for me, I've really felt like a slowing down just of pacing and desire for activity. And I've also noticed like this sort of nesting domestic theme where I'm like, I'm very happy at home. I just feel less inclined even to, pop out for a meal somewhere. I'm more inclined to say to friends, pop over here or we'll come to yours. Have you noticed any of those things with Jupiter and Cancer as well?
I've felt more spacious. Spacious in
Oh,
terms
I
of
love
my
that.
my ability
Yeah.
to explore topics like spirituality or even astrology. Like I feel like I've had more space to really dedicate on personal development, whereas Jupiter and Gemini was just like all over the place, too muchness. And now I just
Yes.
felt like, oh, I can actually kind of wonder and think again and just ruminate and sit with all of the good stuff, which is really nice.
Oh, I love that. And as you're describing that spaciousness, I'm like, oh yeah, I really felt my own schedule, whether it was work or personal, become more calm and manageable by
Right.
the end of
Yeah.
June. Yeah, just more like there is some breathing points in between the frantic pace, I guess.
Yeah,
Yeah, I love that
absolutely.
spacious. Oh, so juicy. And so now we're going to turn our attention to July, which I feel a little bit like a broken record because there are so many months already this year where I'm like, there's this major astrological thing that's happened or happening. But this, I feel, is the last of the very unique events for
Yep.
2025. And of course, we are talking about Uranus changing signs, coming into Gemini as of July 7th. And I imagine that's something people might have questions about. Have you got any sort of ideas or topics or themes that you're really expecting to be front and center with Uranus in Gemini, Britt?
Yeah, well, I was sitting with the transition, right, from Uranus in Taurus to Gemini, and I was really picking up on the fact that, change, especially in Taurus, in a fixed sign, change is actually quite slow and hard. And
Yeah.
I've noticed that with Uranus in Taurus. It's been in an angular house for me, and I've had some changes, but it's been quite like, you have these things that show up that you feel like I'm still like trying to revolutionize or empower in that area. And it's just very hard to break habits, I guess. And I definitely feel that Uranus in Gemini is going to open up the floodgates in terms of our ability to make rapid changes and
Yes.
really see more possibilities and more opportunities that we maybe have not seen in Uranus and Taurus. I'm trying to give a good spin on it also because I have quite a few placements between 2 and 5 of the mutable signs. So I am also
Yes.
bracing myself for a lot of upheaval, if you will.
Yes, a lot of that fast-paced change. I mean, I
Yeah.
think you capture something that is a really important piece about Uranus in Gemini is that, Uranus as a planet, as an entity unto itself, is about doing things differently. And Uranus is a planet that, left to its own devices, will move quite quickly. It's a little bit kind of represented in that saying that I've heard over the last number of years of, move fast and break things.
hmm
And that's a very Uranus thing, that rapid piece of change, whether it's innovation, whether it's change, change is change. Like it can lead you somewhere that you want to go. It can give you more freedom or authenticity. but it can still be quite unsettling, or it can still feel destabilizing initially when things are different from what you're used to them being. So I think when we think about those pieces of Uranus and then we add in the quality of the sign of Gemini, as you're saying, Taurus is more methodical and measured. It's like breaking or coming apart. And Uranus in Gemini, it just feels like everything on fast forward. It feels, if we thought Jupiter in Gemini was fast,
Hmm.
Uranus in Gemini feels a lot. It's even more bouncy. It's even more scattered in terms of the variety of things that are happening all at once.
Totally.
So, yeah, is that kind of part of what you're experiencing or thinking about as well?
Yeah, and also I was thinking about the corresponding body parts with like Taurus being the neck and throat, right? And when we get to Gemini, we get really our ability to move with our hands and our
Mm,
shoulders. So there's a lot more movement, which also means that there's more, potential for disruption and change. And that can be really good if you're stuck in your ways and you feel like that Uranus in Taurus transit just hasn't done it for you. There's like, okay, there's some potential for movement and a lot of activity
yeah,
for
yeah.
sure.
I think that's really true. And I love how you described, in the body, Gemini is like the arms and the hands and the lungs and the breathing, which, we can do a lot more with that part of our body than with the throat, which is the
Yep.
Taurus part. And so it's like, I want to touch more things, or I want to hold more space, or there's more of a breadth of, interest here. One thing I often think about, I think you touched on this like with your own chart, is that, Uranus coming into Gemini is an important shift from like a collective perspective. And then at a personal level, it's very much about what planets might you or the people you're working with have in those early degrees in any of the mutable signs, whether it's Gemini or Virgo or Sagittarius or Pisces, because they will be the parts of the sky that are now diving into their Uranus transits.
Hmm.
And one way I've tried to like normalize this a little bit for people is, every 8 years Uranus changes signs. And so for the last 8 years since like 2018, we've had Uranus in Taurus, which is a fixed sign. So all the fixed signs, Taurus, Leo, Scorpio, and Aquarius, have been doing lots of Uranus transits. But if we go back to the last time Uranus was in a mutable sign, we're looking at like 2003 to 2011. And most people who are listening now would have been alive then and making choices about their lives. And so, if you think about how significant 2003 to 2011 was for you, that may give you a clue as to parts of your chart that are now being, activated again by Uranus. And it's probably been 20 years since that's happened, I guess.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's good to go back and see what happened during that time frame.
Yeah. Yeah, to think about it. And of course, like if I'm thinking about July, I'm like, yes, Uranus is coming into Gemini, but also we're going to have Venus in Gemini this month just to really add a different quality, maybe at a smaller scale, but certainly
Hmm.
bringing in what could be some of the fun things about Gemini, at least initially, I guess.
Yeah. More of a potential is to socialize and to have fun and to really brighten up that part of your chart. That's where Gemini is based.
Yeah. And so I think, oh, yeah, so Venus will be in Gemini as of July 4th, depending on where people are, maybe July 5th. And then Uranus will come into Gemini on the 7th. And of course, one of the other things I know I just wanted to mention, we do have a Mercury retrograde this month,
Yep.
and that will start on July 18th. Is there a way that you typically talk about Mercury retrograde for clients at all, Britt, or if you're working with students?
Yeah, I mean, I don't always pay attention to it as a transit, depending on where someone is in their life, but it's always
Yep.
a good time to go over stuff that you've done previously. So check, editing. It's a great time to really do any paperwork that needs double checking and revising any writing that you've done, retrieving any old data or information. Everything with starting with re is a
The
good
re,
word for
yes.
Mercury. Yeah.
So good. So Mercury will be retrograde from July 18, I think, to about August 11. So that's the second half of the month. Very good for those redoing, revising, reassessing, restructuring, or even just rethinking,
Yep.
reviewing and rethinking. Don't be afraid to repeat something or to revisit it, I guess.
Yeah.
All right. I can feel like the chat is already lighting up today. Should we see if there's any questions that we could dive into?
Yeah, there's a question from Dina about
Yep.
Uranus. What can one
Sure.
expect from Uranus in the eighth house? Glad to have it leave the seventh, though.
Great question, Dina. Yeah, so Uranus in the eighth house. I always think about the eighth house from a couple of different points of view. There's sort of what I know students often think of as like a weird collection of topics that's tied to the eighth house. So I think Uranus coming into the eighth house, on the one hand, it does begin a cycle around financial freedom. How can I create some freedom to do with investments or pension planning, long-term savings? And then part of that, of course, is how do I get a handle on my debt? Any loans or obligations I might have, whether that's credit cards, student loans, car loans, housing loans, any kind of debt or financial owing that you have. Uranus in the eighth can start to get you thinking maybe a little out of the box in terms of how to handle that, whether that's accelerated payments, whether that's restructuring. So that idea of shaking up some of those money elements in one's life would be relevant with Uranus coming into the eighth. And then the eighth house also can be a repository, like a part of the chart where some of our fears or our worries, some of the deeper psychological elements might kind of rest. Sometimes they're really strong emotions to do with grief or to do with loss. And other times it's a clue that one of the general ways to connect with a planet, a big planet or any planet coming into the eighth, is that it's a clue to reconnect with your psychological self, your internal, maybe unconscious elements. What is it that I need to know is maybe a fear or worry I have, and how do I want to manage that in a way that might help me care, for myself more? What about you, Britt? How do you think about Uranus into the eighth house?
Yeah, I agree with all of what you said. Part of it is, of course, having to do with resources, shared resources, right? So resources from other people, sometimes partners. So that can also be, desire to change things. Maybe you're living with someone and you want to go through your shared collection and see what you can get rid of or how to create more empowerment or just more freedom. Oftentimes I like to remind folks that Uranus is not just about change for the sake of it, but it's about greater freedom and authenticity. So oftentimes there's an element of like, okay, how can I rid myself of the junk, quote unquote, that I don't need
Yes,
anymore? And sometimes
yes.
that's financial material. Sometimes it's also more mental in nature, right? As you spoke to the more mental anguish that can sometimes occur in this house. So yeah, there's maybe an increased restlessness or anxiety that can occur with this transit, but I will say it's probably depending on any other planets or points that are impacted by this transit. I think Uranus in the eighth by itself will not just have that influence.
That's a really good point. Yeah, that Uranus is obviously coming into a new house for anyone who's working with the whole sign house format of a chart. However, you're most likely to see the energy or the activation of transiting Uranus when it's directly triggering by degree a planet or an angle in your birth chart. So I know we talk a lot about a planet like Uranus changing signs because it's sort of a shift in the collective.
Hmm.
But if we're doing timing for a personal individual, and I had this with a client just this week, we're talking about Uranus in Gemini, but we're talking about it as a big theme for 2026 because they have a planet at 2 degrees of a mutable sign, and Uranus will be at 2 degrees of Gemini in 2026. So it's like that's a theme for next year.
Right. Totally.
Yeah, that's such a good point. One thing you said too, Britt, that I think is so good and worth just amplifying is that idea of lightening your load. Uranus is such a, it's a sky god, it's about movement, any kind of flying creature or contraption is very Uranus. And of course, all of those things, the lighter you are, the more you can fly, the more free you can fly. And so getting rid of physical things or psychological, mental things, I love how you're describing that, especially in the context of Uranus in the eighth house for Dina.
Yep, I may or may
Yeah.
not also have this
Ah,
this exact.
Dina, Brit's familiar. And I was like, oh, this is the Scorpio rising chart.
Yep.
So
Yeah,
got
I'm
it.
very aware.
Got it. Okay, so let's see if there's any other questions that we should get to.
There is a question from Nam. My daughter
Yeah.
has 4th house in Capricorn. Is it true she will grow up with only one parent? And what else can you tell me about this placement? Her Mars is also in Capricorn. So there's 4th house Capricorn with Mars present
With
there.
Mars there.
We
Yeah,
don't know
I
anything
yeah.
else.
That's okay. Yeah, so I think there's a couple of things. I personally wouldn't make any statement like she'll only have one parent or not just off that information. What I would say is, Capricorn and fourth house. Capricorn is often about structure, it's about stability, it's an earth sign. So we would think about some of those qualities as being present for your daughter, Nam. However, in terms of, is it a stable Capricorn fourth house, or is it a fourth house Capricorn that comes with some instability or other challenges? A lot of that would depend on the placement of Saturn in the chart and, the condition of Saturn by sign and by house. I would also be curious to know, if it's a day chart or a night chart, because that can change whether we have more of a productive, stabilizing version of Saturn, or whether we have a little bit more of that limiting, restricting version of Saturn. Having Mars in the fourth house is definitely good information to have. But again, to kind of understand, is this like a more constructive version of Mars or a more challenging, problematic version of Mars? There'd be other pieces, the daytime, nighttime, the sect of the chart, but also, what planets are interacting with Mars. And of course, Mars in Capricorn, again, where is Saturn? In general, Mars in a constructive way can be, Mars in Capricorn, this is the exalted place of Mars. And so when we don't have the other pieces, all I could say is if this is showing up in a helpful way, this would be a child that's learning maybe some resilience or independence or some autonomy as a result of their childhood. And if it's showing up in a more challenging or problematic way, it could be that this is somebody who is dealing with a level of disruption or a level of not knowing that is tied to the home in which they're growing up. So I think that's all I would say based on what we have. What about you, Britt? Would you add anything else in, or would you approach it similarly or differently?
I would approach it the same way, and I would just want to remind Nam and anyone watching that, we have 12 templates for the rising signs. So there's 1 out of 12 people that have Capricorn in the 4th house, roughly, right?
Yeah.
So that in and of itself will not say a whole lot about your childhood experience and whether you grow up with two parents, happy parents, divorced parents, single parents, whatnot. That in and of itself is not enough information. So it's always good to look at the chart specifics, like Kelly mentioned, sect, where Saturn is, and what kind of aspects are involved, and then you'll create more of a cohesive picture. So
Yeah, more of
don't be
like a full
afraid.
picture. Yeah. And I think that's a great point, Britt, that you make. There are 12 chart templates based on the 12 different rising signs. And at just the rule of averages, 1/12 of people born would have this Libra rising chart with Capricorn on the fourth house. But the way the nuances and the unique experiences come in is where are the planets and what are they contributing? And it is tricky to make absolute statements about just one or two pieces of astrology info. This could be someone who I would also just generally think about family as, I would have a curiosity about the moon in the chart
Mhm.
as well. Is the moon square that Mars? Okay, we have a little bit more of those disruptive themes. Or is the moon in Taurus, maybe conjunct Venus or Jupiter? It's like, well, there's something very affirming and very supporting there separate to this. So yeah, I like how you're sort of saying we need the whole, you usually need, and that's where when we look at a chart as astrologers, we're working with not just lists of data. This is just a chart for a lunation, but we're looking at the whole wheel and the dynamics and the relationships between the two. So
Yeah.
it's so rich, so rich.
Yeah. And I think this also speaks to, maybe um, the necessity of a trained professional or you having your own knowledge of your chart because finding information on the internet about certain house placements will never do justice to the actual lived experience and
Yeah,
all of the data that you have in your chart that the internet will not be able to
yeah.
understand fully.
Absolutely. I mean, I have a client who has, I think she has, from memory, I think it's like a moon in Cancer. And it's such a beautiful moon placement when you just consider the sign. But when you start looking at the aspects, there is a little bit more than initially meets the eye going on there for that person. So, yeah. Great question. I mean, I feel like we're getting some good info out. Who's next on our little question list?
JC's asking, any advice for someone experiencing the Saturn-Neptune conjunction in the 12th house?
Another great question. So Saturn and Neptune, they are very close together this month, July. They're only about 10 minutes apart. Technically, they don't come to their exact conjunction to the minute. Saturn is like 1 degree, 56 minutes, and Neptune is like 2 degrees and 5 minutes or something. So they are quite close together. And so lots of people will be sort of experiencing these energies as a pair, even though the technical exact Saturn Neptune conjunction, the first one is February of next year, February of 26. So I think in terms of this question, so if we've got Aries in the 12th house, that means we're a Taurus rising chart, which probably means we have Capricorn on the 9th by whole sign and Aquarius on the 10th, if I've got that
Yep.
right. And so there's a few things here. Neptune coming into Aries is like a longer 14-year cycle. Saturn and Neptune as a combination has themes of surrender, of letting go. One of the images I think a lot about Saturn Neptune combinations is the idea of like a flood washing away, stones or buildings or bricks. The idea of Saturn being, structures made of like earth or solid materials, and Neptune, whether it's like an erosion over time or whether it's that, weakening of the foundations or whether it is the actual washing away. So we've got those themes of softening, of surrender, even of uncertainty. Whenever we have big Neptune themes, we're talking about some confusion and overwhelm. If it's in the 12th house as a general theme, there may be heightened needs for rest. There may be a craving for solitude or isolation. There may be some physical or mental health concerns where slowing down or rest or stepping back from one's regular duties is necessary. These are all things that we come into the 12th house for, reasons we might spend time in 12th house settings. And then if we've got Saturn as the ruler of the 10th house in this chart, it may be that there is some of that surrendering or that washing away energy that's coming up around career. And that could have to do with a loss of faith or a loss of sense of meaning or passion for one's work. It may be that one is struggling with direction or motivation around work and drive. It may be that one wants to give up some responsibilities or pressures where work and career is concerned. So there would be a few things that I would think about that. But I think to reiterate a point that you mentioned earlier, Britt, if, hang on, let me rephrase that. Already getting affected by Mercury. Unless the Saturn Neptune was directly activating a planet or an angle in the chart, it probably wouldn't be the first, it would not be on my short list of things to talk about with a
Mm-hmm.
client. Like there may be other transits that are directly activating the chart. Like is Pluto on the midheaven in this chart, for instance, if we have a midheaven in Aquarius? Uh, so there'd probably be other transits, and there might be other timing factors like secondary progressions or annual perfections that I would talk about that would be more active and specific to the chart rather than the general Saturn Neptune. I think if you have planets in your birth chart at 1 or 2 degrees of any of the cardinal signs of Aries, Cancer, Libra, or Capricorn, then what's going on with Saturn and Neptune in 2025 is really directly relevant for you. But for instance, I don't have placements at those exact degrees in my chart. And when I'm thinking about what's affecting me in my life and my circumstances, I'm not really attuned to Saturn Neptune as the biggest thing for me right now. Britt and I were just talking before we started, like I have a planet at 29 degrees of a fixed sign. So I'm really aware of the Uranus transit that's going on there, but I'm less tuned into the Saturn Neptune. So one little teaching piece I might share here, just as a general, in regards to JC's question, not everything that's happening astrologically will be important for you, and not everything that's happening astrologically is going to be directly impacting you all the time. either. So there's a few pieces about that. What about you, Britt? How would you approach this type of question?
I would approach it the same. I have nothing to add. This is
You're
this is
like, no
perfect. Yeah,
notes.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and
No
I
notes.
think we should also emphasize maybe that the 12th
Yeah,
house is a Caden house, right? So there's a bit of like
yeah,
less activity. So that also makes this Saturn Neptune conjunction already fit in with the qualities of the 12th house of just being a bit
perfect.
more, idle, a bit more wishy-washy or what have you.
Yes. Yeah,
Right?
like
That
Saturn, Neptune itself is kind of wishy-washy, but so, particularly the sixth and 12th houses, we're not at our
yeah.
most productive or effective. And so you're saying there's kind of a match here.
There is a match, and
Yeah.
also, it would be different maybe if this was an angular house for you, like just to add to
Yeah.
the instances where this transit might be more felt or more experienced than in this case, where I would say just surrender and give into this transit, and it may just pass without you noticing it all too much.
Yeah, you might be sort of generally aware of it as being part of the
Hmm.
backdrop without it being the centered piece.
Yep.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Yeah. And that reminds me of something we were talking about earlier. If the Saturn Neptune was coming into an angular house in your chart, or if Uranus into Gemini is an angular house in your chart, then you might be a little more struck by that because, of course, the
Hmm.
angular houses, which are 1, 4, 7, and 10, these are the houses in the birth chart that are where we get a lot of our drive, a lot of our energy and activity from. So that's a really good point for people.
Yep. Yeah, and
Yeah.
also the angular houses represent topics that are front and center of our lives, right? We have
Yes.
our
Right in our
health with
face.
the first
Yeah.
house, we have our family, we have our significant others, and we have our career. So these are usually the topics that we are most preoccupied with on a day-to-day basis. And some of the other houses may be a bit more, bit less central to our
Yes.
focus.
Yeah. I love
Yep.
that. So good, Brett. Okay, let's do another question.
Which planet has better strength in Aries, Saturn or Neptune? Asks Lisa.
Oh, this is a really good question. I was hoping we'd get to this one. So I'll say a short answer and then we'll explain it. Neither might be the answer here. The way I understand this is that when we're talking about strength for planets in signs, we're often thinking about something technically to do with the dignity or the rulership, exaltation, detriment, and fall of a planet based on its sign-based position. And the sign-based piece of a planet is one factor of understanding a planet's overall condition. And this applies to the visible planets, which is not the outer planets. So Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, they're not really assessed in this way of, better strength or less strength. They sit outside this kind of older rulership or dignity model, which has been a part of astrology for over 2,000 years, whereas the modern planets, Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, have only been included in astrology for a couple of hundred years. Uranus was only discovered in the 1780s, I think 1781. Neptune around the mid 1850s, and then Pluto in the 1930s. And so they are very recent inclusions. So the modern or like outer planets are treated differently. So Saturn is certainly a planet that we could say something around its strength position in Aries. And Saturn's technical designation in Aries is the fall placement. And so Saturn is exalted in the sign of Libra, and Saturn is in its fall, which is sometimes known as its depression or exile, when Saturn is in Aries. And so what we have here is a Saturn that is operating without respect or esteem. So the exaltation rulership piece has a lot to do with respect and esteem, being held up on a pedestal, that's exaltation, and then like falling off the pedestal or coming low down. That is part of the fall placement of a planet. So we have a Saturn that is kind of struggling to affect things that are of a Saturnian nature. Saturn is about order, a regulation, rules. It's about foundation. It's about structure. It can be about protection. And so these are some of the things that are going to have more of a disintegrating quality or like a coming apart or being updated kind of quality while Saturn is in Aries. And so I don't know that Saturn or Neptune in Aries is necessarily a placement that we would be upholding in the way that we might be upholding Jupiter and Cancer, for instance. That's the exaltation placement of Jupiter. So there's hope for integrity or ethics or fairness when Jupiter is raised up. And keep in mind, Jupiter has only just come into Cancer. We have a whole year of that. Saturn is just giving us a preview of what its energy in Aries is going to be like. So June, July, August of 25 is like a preview of Saturn in Aries that really kind of kicks in as of February of 2026. We have a bit over 2 years starting in Feb 26. How do you think about that strength piece, Britt, for Saturn and Neptune in Aries?
Yeah, in a similar way, like just the seven traditional planets are part of
Yeah.
the traditional dignity scheme, right? And then the outer planets not so much. So Saturn, of course, as you explained, has its fall in Aries, and you've explained that beautifully what that means. So in a way, we have like a planet in fall and a planet that, doesn't have anything to do with Aries or any of the other signs for
Yeah.
that matter. So yeah, there's no real strength from this transit. And I think what Kelly was saying about, there being a lack of esteem for Saturn in a Mars ruled sign or in this Mars ruled sign, right? Because of its fall placement. It just like, if you think about the qualities of Aries just being fast paced and hurried, it doesn't really match with what Saturn is trying to do and trying to achieve. So you kind of see this mismatch between the two energies, and that's what this refers to.
That is a really good point. And I think anytime we get Mars Saturn combinations, whether it's Mars in a Saturn sign or Saturn in a Mars ruled sign or aspects between Mars and Saturn, especially when there's some friction or challenge, like Saturn is in fall in Aries. What I think you've identified this one of the core themes, which is there's a clash around timelines. There's a
Hmm.
clash around the short-term, immediate nature, kind of reactive energy of Mars versus the more slow, measured, considering of consequences version of Saturn. And I think something about Saturn in Aries might be a clue that things that are happening quickly may not have been well thought through from a consequences perspective, or there may be unintended lingering effects of things that are happening really quickly. And so I think with Saturn in Aries, something you've brought up, which I think is so important, is that we all take some time for research or planning or preparation, that some hesitation is good because Saturn is losing some of its natural quality to be hesitant, maybe even to be have a little bit of fear. And I'm not saying we should all be afraid, but a small amount of fear sometimes prompts us to do our due diligence, to
Right.
have we looked into this? Have we done our research? Okay, we know eyes wide open what we're getting into and we go ahead. And Saturn in Aries is like, well, we just got to do it now. It's urgent. It's an immediate pressing drama. It's an emergency and things will get done that won't turn out to be so good in the long run. So I think
Yeah.
that piece about the friction of timelines with Saturn Mars is really important to think
I
about.
think probably a good question to ask during this transit is when you feel yourself hurried or you feel like a sense of urgency about something, just ask yourself like whose timeline is this? Is this
Mm.
a timeline that feels right for me, or am I imagining a pace that just is in the air that doesn't really fit with what I'm trying to achieve here?
This is so beautiful, Britt. I'm like, oh, this like now we're doing therapy session. This is so good. Because that's something that I'll often talk about with my therapist is like, where is that pressure or urgency coming from? Is
Hmm.
this something that you're assuming is part of your scenario? Is it explicitly a pressure that somebody else is putting on you? Like it's urgent for the other person, but you get to engage with, look, it's not urgent for me. So it's that idea of where is that? I think that's a great question, Britt. Where is the urgency coming from? Love that. Oh my gosh, this has been so rich. I feel like we could talk for about 3 more hours, but I know we wanted
Totally,
to
yeah.
just jump on and check in with you all and answer a few questions. Britt, I know students, everyone listening is always so happy to see you here. Where can people find out more about you and your work with astrology, your offerings and things like that?
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. So my work you can find at innerverse.nl. I give birth chart consultations. I do coaching. I have a coaching container. So if you're curious about my work, just check out that website and subscribe to my newsletter. And I hope
Excellent.
to hear from anyone. It's always nice to be in touch with students.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's your kind of wait time at the moment for consults, Britt? Are you a couple of weeks out or a month out? What kind of
Usually like
timeline?
a couple of weeks. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
So
So
I
if
book about,
anybody's
yeah,
thinking, like, I want to know about Saturn, Neptune in my chart, or I want to find out more about Uranus and Gemini, you could certainly talk with them about that in their own chart.
absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Ah, well, thank you so much for being here, Britt. I want to make sure all of you listening know as well that the next intake for my astrology training program is coming up in September. So if you want to get some early info, pop over to kellysastrology.com and go to the Learn Astrology tab. There's lots of info about the full astrology training program. And if that's right for you, we look forward to seeing you in class in September. Otherwise, Britt and I will probably see you back here again next month for a bit more discussion about astrology and a few more questions. Thanks again for joining me, Britt.
Thank you, Kelly.
My pleasure. All right, we'll see you all again soon. Bye for
Bye,
now.
everyone. Bye.